On July 3rd, 1984, Nancy Rushman's dream of a quaint souvenir shop turned into a nightmare. What awaited her within its weathered walls of this property in Costa Rica was far from the picturesque scene she had envisioned. Just 3 days before renovations were set to commence, Nancy vanished without a trace. When she reappeared, her clothes were shredded, her once vibrant spirit shattered, and her eyes haunted by an unspeakable terror. This is Nancy's harrowing account, recounted from her hospital bed as she struggled to piece together the horrors she endured.
I got the idea to open a souvenir shop when I was still working as an ER nurse at the University of Wisconsin. The shifts were getting worse, and I was getting older, which meant I was constantly tired. Last year, I realized I had enough savings to retire early. I am from Ohio and don't have any friends there, but longed for a peaceful life. I took the chance and decided to move to this town. I wanted to start anew. As soon as I made the purchase, I went to check out the shop the first week of May, so I could get a scope of the renovation that needed to be done. The whole place was dirt cheap because it was isolated and a bit off the hiking trails. But it still had a great view of the lake, and I could build a watch station near it, maybe even run a cafe by the side. The opportunities felt endless with it. My goal for the visit was to gauge the cleanup and see if I could do it myself to save money. Now, I had visited the place before and felt nothing out of the ordinary. The shop did not strike me as anything but just another rundown place near the woods. But that day, I felt a chill creep down my back when I stepped out of my car. The sunlight felt too bright. It was also unnaturally silent. There was no bird song or the general bustle of the forest. Perhaps it was because of the storm from the day before. It was wet all around, and maybe I shouldn't have chosen that day to do the cleanup and wait for everything to dry first, but I wanted to get it done ASAP. The drive was long, and I didn't want to come back another day. The shop was musty when I went in, augmented by the dampness of the place. It had once been a cottage, and the previous owners had turned the 2 stories into one and built the shop. This meant that there was still an attic and a basement available. The shop was chilly, but luckily I had my jacket. I was surprised to see there wasn't much to clean. I could have sworn it was a bigger mess before, but there was no one who would have tidied up. Must have been my imagination. As I roamed around, I kept glancing at the boarded-up windows whenever it got colder. I couldn't make sense of it. Started feeling creeped out, like someone was watching me. I got goosebumps, but no one was around. It got really weird when I neared the basement door. Downstairs was even mustier and dirtier. The stairs were shaky, and it was so dark I was glad I had a powerful flashlight. I found nothing unusual. Basements always gave me the creeps, though. While hunting for a light bulb, something in the corner caught my eye. A chest. It looked antique, despite being covered in dust. Curiosity got the better of me, so I flicked on the light and tried opening it. A shiver ran down my spine, probably from the cold. But the chest seemed to call to me, weirdly enough. Can't remember why I was so eager to open it. To my surprise, it was unlocked. Inside, on a red velvet cushion, was an old, yellowed skull. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this some twisted prank? The skull was unmistakably human and small. It was a child's. None of it made sense. Why stash a skull in a chest in a basement? I didn't have answers, but I knew I had to involve the police and get out of there fast. There was something seriously wrong, and I didn't want to be caught up in it any more than I already was. As soon as I made up my mind, the air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Terrified, I shut the chest and scrambled back upstairs. That's when the sensation of being watched intensified. I ran outside the shop building, but there was no one there. I ran around the house twice to see if this was someone pulling an awful prank on me, but no, there was no one and no sign to say another person had been there. I thought I had imagined it, because seeing that skull had thrown me off my game. I didn't want to be there anymore, so I got in my car and left the shop. The drive from the shop to my home only took 20 minutes, and 10 of those 20 minutes belonged to a minor unpaved road between this rundown shop and the other shops in the area. It was the average narrow road in a forest, lined with towering trees and often covered in rotting leaves. I drove carefully on that road because I didn't want to slip or run off a crossing animal. It took me a good 3 minutes to realize that the road seemed longer than usual. I had been driving for about 15 minutes when I realized I was still on the road. I couldn't help but wonder if I was hallucinating, because the road did not seem to end. By now, I had to be seeing the other shops. I kept on driving, trying not to panic. By now, I knew something was wrong. I checked the time on my dash again and again, and in no time, I'd been driving for 20 minutes, then 30 minutes. As I was driving, I frantically looked around, trying to find at least one clue that pointed out I was finally getting out of this accursed road like I was supposed to. And that's when I spotted it. In between two old, ghostly elm trees, there was a sign with letters of red paint on it. I was certain it had not been there when I was going back to the shop. I slowed down the car so I could read the sign, and when I did, my blood froze over. "Bury it," the sign said. Bury what? Why was there a sign like that on the side of the road? I couldn't shake the feeling that the sign was for me. I was lost in the middle of a forest on a road that led to nowhere, that should have led me back home. I needed to get out of this road before it drove me crazy. I floored the pedal to the gas and sped, despite the treacherous terrain. 10 minutes later, to my great horror, I saw the sign again. It wasn't possible. I started to panic, making each breath a struggle. I sped up even more, and after some more time, the sign crossed the corner of my eyes again. Each time I passed it, it screamed at me more and more, the red paint seemingly brighter, like blood. And at one point, I slammed the brakes because now the paint was dripping like it was freshly painted. There was a scream loaded in my throat, and tears ran down my cheeks. The light of the day got brighter and brighter. The air was sweltering, even breathing was difficult, and I smelled smoke. But nothing was burning, at least not in my vision. I was crying by this point, cursing myself for ever moving here and trying to do this. If I had stayed back in the city, doing my job, and ignoring everything else, I wouldn't have been stuck in this nightmare. By now, I was driving for hours. I then noticed something. I was running out of gas. The sign appeared again, the red of the paint more violent, splattered on the board and dripping, and I could smell the blood from here, metallic and fresh. I didn't know how I could smell it all the way from my car. I worked as a nurse, so I could tell. I was used to blood, though I have never been afraid of it before. Bury it. I could almost hear it now, like someone was whispering it in my ear. At first I thought I was imagining it, but each time I passed the sign, an inhuman voice said the words louder and louder. Bury it. I yelled back, bury what? This time that inhuman voice exploded in my ears as if its mouth was right beside my ear. I fell to the ground and curled up, terrified. I felt a warm breath moving around my face and my body. I was so frightened I didn't uncurl or open my eyes. As soon as I stopped feeling that breath, I bolted towards my car and floored the gas. All I wanted was to wake up from this nightmare. I could see the sign again as I approached it, but this time there was something else. Standing next to it were my mother and father. It wasn't possible, because they both lived in my home state, Ohio, happily in their nursing home. I visited them once a month, and we exchanged letters and telephone calls whenever we could. But this illusion was too real. They were standing beside the sign, faces terrified and pale, mouthing the words, bury it. I lost control of the car. It veered off the road and crashed into a tree. There was a lot of smoke. I touched my head and it was bleeding. The door was stuck, so I had to break the glass to get out. I cut myself in many places as I crawled out. My whole body hurt. Without thinking about it, I rushed to the sign, only to find the place empty. The sign had disappeared, and so had my parents. I couldn't explain what was happening. The whispers and screeches of bury it were getting louder in frequency. I covered my ears tightly, but it made no difference. The sounds were inside my head. The moment I started running towards the shop, I could feel the screaming volume go down in my head. By the time I stepped on the plot, even before I ran down the steps to the basement, the screaming turned into faint whispers, as if it knew that I finally knew what I had to bury. During all this, I prayed that my parents were fine. I prayed that what I saw earlier was nothing but an illusion. I also prayed that I never saw the source of the words bury it. I kept feeling the urge to look over my shoulders, but I resisted, for I had had enough of this nightmare. I also ignored the fact that it should have taken me a long time to run back to the shop on foot. Instead, it took me about 5 minutes. I just knew I had a task to complete. I sobbed uncontrollably as I stumbled into the basement. I could hear the whispers again, but now it was a different voice. It was the voice of a child.
Bury it, bury me. Set me free, please.
said the voice. The skull was still there when I opened the chest, and when I tried to touch it, it was burning hot. My hands blistered, and I tried to use the fabric of my shirt to hold it, but I didn't dare drop it. Hugging it to my chest, ignoring the burn, I came outside and fell to my knees behind the shop. I didn't wait to find a shovel to dig, I used my hands. My nails and fingertips bled as I tore through the dirt, and the dirt mixed with my blood and the tears that fell off my cheeks. But I didn't care. As soon as the hole I dug was deep enough to place the skull in it, I threw the thing inside and pushed the mound of dirt over it. At that very moment, an unholy shriek rang in my ear, and I clutched my head. It felt like someone stabbed my brain with 100 forks. And that is all I remember before waking up in the middle of the night. There were no noises, and I was still kneeling next to the grave I dug for the skull. It felt like I had been in a dream, except for the actual evidence right in front of me. Without waiting a second, I fled the shop and tried to find my way back down the road. I wandered for what felt like ages until I reached the tree where I had crashed my car. But my car was gone. The tree, the ground, it had signs of a car crash, but not of a crash that happened just yesterday. I ran away as fast as I could, disregarding the pain I was in, until I finally got off that cursed road and saw the other shops of the village. That's when I was sure the nightmare was over.
The townsfolk discovered Nancy in a harrowing state and promptly alerted the authorities. At the hospital, Nancy recounted her ordeal. The police returned to the shop, uncovering the enigmatic chest, but their excavation around the plot yielded no skull. What led the police most was narrative. She detailed her experience as if it transpired hours, when in reality, for a full month. Despite extensive no trace of Nancy's strength. The police were dead. Meanwhile, American parents, unable to bear the tragedy, succumbed to strokes 2 weeks after Nancy disappeared. Mysteriously on the very same day, Nancy staunchly clung to her version of events, perplexing the investigators, who attributed her inconsistencies to severe trauma, concluding that her mind had distorted the timeline of her torment. Nancy was confined to a mental asylum for the next 2 years, until the weight of her anguish became too much to bear. Nancy blamed herself for the death of her parents. On July 3, 1986, exactly 2 years from the day they died, Nancy took her own life. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.